Hello there, dear listener. Thank you. Thank you for choosing to spend a little time with an old woman's story. It truly means a great deal, especially now that my voice, well, it's not what it used to be. My name is Rose, and if you're hearing this, it means I've found a way to share a truth I carried for many, many years. A truth too heavy to speak aloud while I walked this earth, yet too important to take with me when I left it. They say a grandmother's love is unconditional, and it is a fierce, protective thing, deep as the deepest well. But let me tell you, dear listener, there are moments when that love is tested, pushed to its very breaking point, when the threads of family loyalty snap under the weight of sheer, unadulterated greed. I learned this when my own son, my flesh and blood, stood by silently as his wife, Beatrice, ripped a piece of my heart out, tearing a hole in our family that would bleed for decades. I can still hear her voice, ringing in my ears like a poisoned bell. Oh, Rose, Beatrice would purr, her smile too wide, too sharp. Darling, dear Rose, we simply must secure Thomas's future. You understand, don't you? Old family debts, old family obligations. Sometimes a clean slate requires a little rearrangement. Her eyes, cold as chipped ice, would flick to Evelyn, sitting quietly beside me, and a shiver would run down my spine. A rearrangement, she called it. What it was, plain and simple, was theft. A theft cloaked in politeness, leaving a wound that festered with every forced family gathering, every insincere hug. Can you imagine the slow burn of that kind of injustice? The quiet rage of watching what was rightfully taken, celebrated right before your eyes, and being utterly powerless to stop it? You see, sometimes life unfolds like a quilt. Each patch a memory, each stitch a lesson learned. Some patches are bright and cheerful, full of laughter and sunshine, like the yellow gingham of a childhood summer picnic. Others are faded with sorrow, the deep, indigo blues of a long winter's night, heavy with the weight of unspoken words. I've lived long enough to see many such quilts made, and I've pieced a few of my own, each one a testament to time and resilience. But the most important one, that one was never truly finished until after my last breath. And its final, most vital stitch, that was sewn by my granddaughter, Lily. A stitch that finally made the whole pattern clear. This isn't just a story about fabric and thread. It's about a family torn apart by a shocking betrayal, about an old woman's quiet, decades long quest for justice, and how sometimes the quietest person in the room holds all the cards. This tale might just make you rethink who truly holds the power, and how some battles aren't fought with shouts, but with silent strength and the undeniable, infuriating weight of truth. Part 1. The fabric of family, early life, and the twin threads of children. My life began, much like any good quilt, with a sturdy foundation. My family, the Adams family, had farmed this land in Tennessee for generations. We weren't wealthy, not by any stretch, but we were rich in something far more precious: community, honest work, and a deep, abiding respect for fairness. That respect was sown into me from the very first breath, a principle as solid as the bedrock beneath our rolling hills. Then came Arthur, my late husband. He was the thread that held me, and later our family, together. Steady as an oak, with hands that knew the feel of good timber and a heart that beat with the quiet rhythm of our small town. We built our home together, piece by painstaking piece, brick by laughter-filled brick on Sycamore Lane. It wasn't grand, no sprawling mansion, but it was ours. It smelled of freshly baked bread, of Arthur's pipe tobacco, and of the sweet, certain promise of a shared future. We had two children, our little ones, who grew up within those walls. Thomas, my son, born first, a boy with Arthur's kind eyes and my gentle spirit. He was agreeable, easygoing, perhaps a little too much so. He liked things to be calm, to avoid conflict at all costs. It was a trait that, I would later learn, could be both a blessing and a devastating curse. a placid nature, so easily swayed by the stronger will of others. Then came my Evelyn, my spirited Evelyn. She wasn't just my daughter, she was my soul's mirror, a vibrant, blazing thread in the fabric of my own being. Even as a child, she had a fire within her, a blazing sense of fairness that made her argue fiercely with Thomas if he took an extra cookie or tried to cheat at checkers. Thomas, that's not fair. You took two, she'd declare, her small finger pointing decisively. Thomas would just shrug. Mama said I could. No, I didn't, I'd interject, a smile playing on my lips. It's not fair, Mama. Evelyn would insist, eyes wide with righteous indignation, not for herself, but for the principle of the thing. That spark never dimmed. She grew into a formidable young woman, brilliant and principled. She went off to law school, determined to use her sharp mind to fight for justice, for those whose voices had been silenced. Every time she came home, she filled our modest house with a vibrant, almost electric energy, a passionate belief in right and wrong that always stirred my heart and reminded me of the best of myself. My pride in her was boundless, a comfort, a joy that ran deeper than any other. Our family also owned a small, sacred piece of land by the river, a few acres of wooded tranquility that had been in my side of the family for generations. It wasn't prime real estate for development, no, not large enough to draw the eye of big corporations, but it held immense sentimental value. It was where Arthur taught us all to skip stones, where Evelyn and I would sit on the banks, sketching wildflowers and dreaming aloud about the future, her head resting on my shoulder. We called it Evelyn's Meadow, a place she planned to turn into a quiet community garden, a sanctuary for nature and for children to learn about the simple beauty of growing things. It was her birthright, her little piece of heaven, promised to her by my grandmother, then by my mother, and finally by me. A legacy of simple beauty, not grand wealth. Thomas, in his early 20s, brought Beatrice home one summer. She was a vision, I'll give her that. Sharp features, perfectly coiffed blonde hair, and a smile that seemed to dazzle everyone she met. But beneath that veneer, I sensed something colder, something calculating. She had a certain ambition about her, a hunger I hadn't seen in our quiet town, not in such an overt, almost aggressive way. She moved with a calculated grace, always observing, always assessing what she could gain from a situation, rather than what she could contribute. I tried, truly I did, to welcome her, to weave her into the family quilt with open arms and a loving heart. I baked her pies, listened to her stories, offered advice, hoping to find common ground. But a part of me, a quiet, knowing part that had seen many seasons of human nature, always felt a subtle discord, like a patch of glittering lame trying desperately, awkwardly, to fit into a homespun, honest design. My intuition screamed, "Be careful, Rose," but I silenced it. Thomas, my sweet, naive Thomas, was utterly smitten, completely blinded by her beauty and her superficial charm, by her promises of a grander life. And I, like far too many mothers, chose to silence my gut feeling and simply hoped for the best in my son's chosen partner. A mother's blind spot, perhaps, one that would cost us dearly, one that would unravel more than just a few threads, but the very integrity of our family. I remember the exact day the first tremor of unease ran through me. Evelyn came to me, her face pale, a deep knot of worry etched between her brows. It was a Saturday, I believe, because the scent of freshly cut grass was drifting in through the open window, a peaceful smell so at odds with the turmoil she carried. "Mama," she whispered, her voice barely audible, as if the words themselves pained her, "Beatrice keeps asking about the river land. She presses me about selling it, says it's wasted on a garden, that it could be developed for so much more. She even hinted that if I don't sell it, Thomas and she might not be able to build their future here." as if my meadow is the only thing standing between them and prosperity. I remember patting her hand, trying to brush it off with a gentle wave of dismissal. Don't you worry, darling. That land is yours. It always has been, always will be. Beatrice just doesn't understand the sentimental value, that's all. She sees numbers, not memories. I tried to reassure her to soothe my own rising anxiety, hoping it was just a misunderstanding, a clumsy, ambitious suggestion. Oh, how I wished I hadn't dismissed it so easily. It was the first sign, a faint flicker of a shadow, a warning that echoed quietly in my heart, a little bell chiming danger. But I chose to believe in the good, to trust in family, hoping against hope that my initial misgivings were unfounded. And that, dear listener, was my first mistake. A thread loosely tied, waiting to fray. A tiny tear in the fabric, easily ignored but destined to spread and spread until it ripped the whole cloth apart. The years that followed brought both joy and profound sorrow. My precious granddaughter, Lily, was born, a tiny, perfect bundle of hope that instantly stitched new joy into my heart. She was a breath of fresh air, reminding me so much of Evelyn, that same quiet intelligence, that same thoughtful gaze, that innate sense of wonder at the world. She would spend hours with me in my sewing room, her little hands tracing the patterns on my latest projects, watching me piece together fabric squares. Grandma, why do you put the dark colors next to the light ones? She'd ask, her voice a sweet chime, so innocent. Because that's how life is, sweetheart, I'd tell her. Light and shadow, joy and sorrow, they all make up the beauty of the whole. You can't have one without the other, and together, they make something truly beautiful, something strong. She'd listen, wide-eyed, absorbing the lessons of a lifetime, unknowingly preparing for a story she would one day have to unravel, a darkness she would have to face. Then, the true unraveling began. A deep sorrow ripped through our family like a jagged tear in a cherished fabric, a wound so deep it felt like it went bone deep. My beloved sister, Clara, fell gravely ill. It was sudden, a cruel turn of fate that left us all reeling, gasping for breath, clutching at memories. Clara was the last of my siblings, and losing her felt like losing another piece of my own history, a living connection to my youth. Evelyn, always the strong one, the practical one, despite her immense grief, took charge of Clara's affairs. Clara owned a modest but comfortable house in town, fully paid for, and she had a small, carefully managed nest egg, enough to live comfortably in her later years. Her will, drawn up years ago by a trusted, old family attorney, Mr. Thompson, was clear as a bell. Half of her estate to Evelyn, half to me. A simple, fair, and undisputed division, as Clara had always intended, a reflection of her deep love for us both. But then, the vultures began to circle. Mr. Finch, an ambitious, slick young lawyer who had recently taken over Mr. Thompson's practice, and who seemed far too eager to impress Beatrice, started making strange noises. He claimed there was a minor technicality with Clara's will, a clerical error that needed immediate rectification, a formality that had been overlooked. Evelyn, being a lawyer herself, immediately bristled. Her instincts screamed that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. Mr. Finch, Evelyn stated, her voice tight, formal, my aunt's will was drafted by Mr. Thompson. He was meticulous. I've read it. There are no technicalities. What exactly are you referring to? Mr. Finch would just clear his throat, adjust his tie. Ah, Miss Evelyn, just a small, rather common oversight. Nothing to worry your pretty head about. We'll just need a quick amendment, a signature here or there, to clarify the beneficiary's intentions. He'd give a greasy smile that didn't reach his eyes. Evelyn, however, was not one to be easily dismissed. My intentions, Mr. Finch, are clearly stated in the existing document. I insist on seeing every paper, every supposed amendment, every signature. Her suspicion was a quiet hum, but it was growing louder in my own ears too, a discordant note in the family symphony. That's when the whispers, carried by Beatrice to Thomas, began to spread like a festering rash through the family, poisoning every interaction. Insidious, venomous whispers about Evelyn being too greedy, trying to grab everything for herself, taking advantage of a dying old woman's weakness to fill her own pockets. Honestly, Thomas, I overheard Beatrice say one afternoon, her voice hushed but cutting like a knife. Your sister is truly shameless, hovering over poor Clara like a vulture, talking about her will before the poor woman is even cold. It's disgusting. She clearly only cares about money. Thomas would mumble now, Beatrice. Evelyn isn't like that. Oh, isn't she? Beatrice would snap back, her voice suddenly sharp. Then why is she so insistent on changing things, Thomas? Why is she arguing with your family lawyer? She clearly wants more than her fair share. She's a lawyer, Thomas. They're all the same. Beatrice, with her dazzling smile and sharp tongue, was a master manipulator. She fed Thomas little drops of poison, slowly, meticulously, twisting his gentle, trusting nature into something resentful and suspicious, a dark, unfamiliar stranger. She painted Evelyn, my Evelyn, as a cold, conniving opportunist, preying on Clara's final moments, a heartless lawyer only interested in money. The sheer injustice of it made my blood run cold, chilling me to the core. I watched my son, Thomas, caught in Beatrice's web. My heart ached to see the confusion in his eyes slowly, tragically, replaced by a hardening suspicion, a distant coldness that chilled me to the bone. He started spending more and more time alone with Beatrice, whispering in corners, avoiding Evelyn's calls, avoiding my subtle attempts to bring them together, to bridge the growing chasm. The rift was growing, undeniable, a gaping tear in the quilt of our family. The breaking point, the moment the quilt truly began to unravel, came at Clara's estate meeting. It was held in Mr. Finch's sterile, overly air-conditioned office, the air thick with tension and unspoken accusations, a place where truth seemed to wilt and honesty struggled to breathe. Beatrice, dressed impeccably in a severe black suit, sat beside Thomas, her hand resting possessively, almost triumphantly, on his arm. She looked utterly composed, a predator observing her prey, her eyes gleaming with a victory not yet declared. Mr. Finch, a nervous sheen on his brow, studiously avoided eye contact with Evelyn. He began to speak, his voice a drone, announcing that new information had come to light, a handwritten codicil, supposedly found tucked away in Clara's old Bible. This codicil, he claimed, indicated Clara's last-minute wish for all her assets, the house, the money, everything to go solely to Thomas, to secure the family's future and avoid further division. It was a blatant, monstrous lie. A forgery so crude it made my stomach churn, a sickening feeling of knowing helplessness. I knew Clara's handwriting like my own, had seen it for a lifetime, and this was a pathetic, clumsy imitation. I wanted to scream, to leap across the table and tear the fraudulent paper to shreds. I saw Evelyn's face crumple, the color draining from her cheeks, leaving her looking ashen. Her eyes, usually so fierce, so full of fire, filled with unshed tears, burning with the agony of betrayal. She was an attorney, she knew the law, she saw the fraud. She tried to fight. She pulled out Clara's original will, clear and precise, legally notarized and undeniable. "This is a forgery, Mr. Finch," Evelyn cried, her voice trembling but firm, holding up Clara's true will. "This codicil is a fabrication. Look at the signature, it's completely different from Aunt Clara's usual hand. This is fraud." Mr. Finch stammered, "Now, Miss Evelyn, it's an elderly hand, perhaps a tremor." A tremor. Evelyn retorted, her voice rising with indignation. This isn't a tremor, it's a completely different formation. And the witness signatures, they don't match any of Aunt Clara's usual friends. But Thomas, my own son, my gentle boy, blinded by Beatrice's insidious influence, by the lure of easy money, stood against her. He rose, placed a hand on Beatrice's arm, and looked at Evelyn with a cold, blank stare. Evelyn, Thomas said, his voice cold, devoid of warmth, a stranger's voice that cut deeper than any blade, you've done enough. Just accept it. You're always making trouble, always stirring things up. This is what Clara wanted in the end. A clean break for us, for our future. Thomas, Evelyn gasped, utterly devastated. How can you say that? You know Aunt Clara, you know this isn't her. This is Beatrice's doing. Beatrice, ever so smoothly, interjected, now, Evelyn, darling, there's no need for dramatics. We simply want what's best for everyone. For the family. Her smile was a cruel, thin line. The betrayal was complete. It was a wound that would never fully heal, a scar etched deep into my soul. Evelyn, proud and heartbroken, refused to engage in a public brawl with her own brother over a lie so cruel, so demeaning. She knew the fight would only drag her through the mud, expose Thomas's complicity, and further shatter what little dignity remained. I can't fight them, Mama, she told me later, her voice choked with sorrow, her words like daggers in my heart. Not when Thomas believes her. Not when he stands with her over me. It would break what little is left of us. It would break me completely. Her spirit, usually so resilient, was utterly crushed. And she left. She truly left. Moved across the country, started a new life, a new law practice, never looking back at the ashes of our family's trust. The phone calls grew fewer, then stopped. The letters became sporadic, then faded into silence. A vital, irreplaceable patch of my life's quilt was gone, ripped away, leaving a gaping, bleeding hole, a cold emptiness where vibrant laughter once lived. And I was left behind, a quiet, agonizing witness to the unraveling, the silent, furious keeper of a horrifying secret. I knew the truth. I knew Beatrice had orchestrated it, with Mr. Finch as her willing, greedy accomplice. I knew Thomas had been manipulated, blinded by a toxic combination of infatuation, nascent greed, and his own ingrained aversion to conflict, the very trait that made him so easy to control. But how could I prove it without tearing the entire family apart, without exposing my own son to public shame, to ruin? Evelyn had given up the fight, too hurt to continue. And I was just an old woman, grieving the loss of a sister and the cruel fracturing of my family. I couldn't expose my own son, not like that. Not yet. The timing wasn't right. The wound was too fresh, too raw. So I stayed silent. A heavy, aching silence that settled deep in my bones, hardening into a quiet, burning resolve. But I never forgot. Never. Every time I saw Beatrice's triumphant, knowing smile, every time I saw Thomas turn away from any mention of Evelyn, dismissing her existence as if she were a ghost, the pain festered. It settled deep within me, like an old, intractable stain on a cherished quilt, invisible to the casual eye, but a constant, burning reminder of the injustice, a reminder that whispered, remember, remember, this cannot stand. Part 3, The Quiet Weaver Rose's Quiet Reckoning. Years passed. They flowed like the river beside Evelyn's now empty meadow, a silent testament to the passage of time and the lingering wound. The pain of Evelyn's absence was a constant, dull ache, a phantom limb that still throbbed, a void in my daily life that no other presence could fill. Life, as it always does, somehow stubbornly went on. Thomas and Beatrice, seemingly unburdened by their deceit, by the heavy shadow of their ill-gotten gains, thrived. They used the inheritance from Clara's estate, the money and the proceeds from the quick, hushed sale of Clara's house, to expand Thomas's small, struggling hardware business into a thriving regional chain. They bought a bigger, fancier house on the other side of town, far from the humble charm of Sycamore Lane, a house filled with new furniture, new cars, and new, shallow friends, all testament to their success. They sent Lily to exclusive private schools, dressed her in expensive clothes, gave her every material advantage, all funded by what should have been Evelyn's rightful inheritance. And they believed, truly believed, they had gotten away with it. This was the most galling part, their smug, self-satisfied contentment, their audacity. I watched them. I listened. I attended family dinners, biting my tongue, listening to their boasts, their thinly veiled digs at my old-fashioned ways. "Oh, Rose, darling," Beatrice would say, gesturing dismissively at my simple, well-worn kitchen. "It's so quaint here." But really, Thomas and I are thinking of knocking down a wall in our new place. It's just so much more modern to have an open concept, don't you agree? All these little rooms, so confining. It was a barb, a subtle jab at my life, at my choice to stay in Arthur's home. I would just smile and nod, my gaze steady, letting her words fall into the silent well of my resolve. And I meticulously, silently collected. I wasn't a detective, not in the formal sense, but I was a woman who believed in order, in facts, in the undeniable weight of evidence. I had kept every single document related to Clara's estate, pristine, official copies of her true, undisputed will, verified by a notary I still trusted. Old, faded letters from Clara, written in her own elegant hand, explicitly mentioning her plans for Evelyn, her deep love for her sister, her wishes for her legacy. I even had a small, leather-bound journal, a cherished gift from Arthur, where Clara had meticulously recorded her thoughts and desires, including her last wishes and her reflections on the true meaning of family, all inscribed long before Mr. Finch and Beatrice ever hatched their cruel scheme. These were my hidden stitches, my secret arsenal, carefully preserved against the tide of lies. I filed them away, piece by piece, document by document, like an archivist of a truth that longed to be heard, a story waiting for its chance to scream. But the question always gnawed at me, a persistent ache in my mind, sharper than any old age rheumatism. How to use them? How to ensure the truth, painstakingly gathered over decades, would surface, undeniable and unassailable, without me being there to defend it, to explain, to plead my case. Without it becoming a messy, public accusation that would only bring further shame upon my own son, even if he deserved it. No, it had to be with an undeniable, quiet force, a precise surgical strike. A plan that would let justice find its way, even through the tangled, knotted threads of deceit. It had to be carefully orchestrated, a final, deliberate act of love and defiance, a posthumous whisper that would echo louder than any shout, a truth that would resonate even in my absence, long after they thought I was just a memory. And then, one quiet afternoon, as I sat in my sewing room, the late afternoon sun slanting golden through the lace curtains, my old fingers tracing the familiar, worn patterns on my beloved heirloom quilt, the one that had been passed down through generations of Adam's women, smelling of lavender and old memories, draped over my lap. An idea, quiet as a whispered prayer, began to form. An idea born of desperate love, enduring injustice, and the deep, simmering resentment that had brewed for far too long. The quilt, it was perfect. It was symbolic. It was family. It was full of secrets, just like our lives had become. And Lily, my intelligent, observant Lily, she was the one. She had that same spark of justice, that same quiet determination as Evelyn. She was principled, sharp, and most importantly, she deeply loved her Grandma Rose. She would understand, she would see. She had the eyes to see what others chose to ignore and the heart to fight for what was right. I chose a specific patch. A plain, unassuming square of faded calico near the bottom edge, where a child's fingers might often absent-mindedly trace the pattern. Nothing flashy, nothing that would draw immediate attention. No one, not Thomas, certainly not Beatrice, would ever suspect it. And inside, nestled deep within the batting, where only the most determined fingers would ever find it, I painstakingly sewed a small, waterproof packet. It contained everything: pristine, official copies of Clara's true will, verified by a notary I still trusted, meticulously transcribed excerpts from her journal, clearly stating her intentions and love for Evelyn. A detailed, chronological account of Beatrice's manipulations, down to the dates and names of the complicit parties, including Mr. Finch's involvement, and even a carefully worded letter from me, written in my own shaky hand, explaining every single detail, every agonizing lie, every stolen dollar, every tear shed for Evelyn. It was my final testimony, my last word on the matter. And most importantly, on the calico patch itself, with a single, almost invisible thread, a thread so thin it was barely perceptible unless you were truly looking, I stitched those symbolic shapes. A final, coded message only Lily would recognize, a secret language between us. A compass for guidance, for finding the true path through the labyrinth of deceit. A broken scale for justice denied, for the gross imbalance they had created. And a wilting rose for Evelyn, my dear sister whose life had been dimmed, whose spirit had been crushed by their greed. A rose that longed to bloom again. It took me months to complete, my dear. Months of quiet, painstaking, often tearful work, often late into the night when the house was silent and my grief felt most potent. My old eyes strained in the fading light, my fingers, gnarled and stiff with age, ached with every stitch, every precise needle movement. But I worked in secret, every stitch a silent promise to Evelyn, a prayer for justice, a testament to my unwavering resolve, a monument to the fury I had held so deeply, so silently for so long. This wasn't revenge for revenge's sake, not a crude act of vengeance born of bitterness that would consume me. No, this was about restoring dignity. It was about cleaning the stain, even if it meant tearing a temporary hole, a painful rift in the fabric of our family. But some holes, I believed with all my heart, needed to be torn to let the cleansing light in, to allow the truth to breathe, to finally scream. I made sure Lily was always drawn to that quilt. I'd tell her stories about it, wrap her in it on cold evenings, subtly drawing her attention to the texture, the feel of the fabric, the intricacy of the stitches. I'd say, "Feel that little bump, Lily? That's where a button used to be." Every imperfection has a story. I planted the seed, trusting her curious nature, her sharp mind, to find it when the time was right. I knew she would intuitively understand its significance, even without knowing its full, devastating secret. I simply placed the tool in her hands and stepped back, waiting for the final act, for the curtain to rise on a drama only I had scripted. My health, as it tends to do for us old folks, continued its gentle decline. It was a slow, quiet fading, like the last embers of a fire, settling into ash, the light receding, but the warmth still lingering. I accepted it, I truly did. I had lived a full life, a good life, despite the sorrows and the burdens I had carried. I watched Lily grow into a beautiful, principled young woman, a testament to the good heart that beat within her, a heart untainted by the greed that had poisoned her parents. My heart swelled with pride and a quiet, profound sense of peace, knowing that my final act of justice, my ultimate legacy, was secure in her capable hands. The family gathered more frequently then as my strength waned. Thomas and Beatrice would visit, their smiles now tinged with an uncomfortable pity, a saccharine concern that felt more like impatience, a barely concealed eagerness. They were waiting, I knew. waiting for my passing, for the final distribution of my own modest inheritance. "Mother, are you comfortable?" Thomas would ask, his voice strained, avoiding my direct gaze. Perfectly, I'd reply, my eyes holding his, knowing he couldn't meet them. Beatrice would hover. "Rose, darling, you must be so tired. Don't worry about anything. Thomas and I will take care of everything once you're resting." She'd pat my hand, a cold, impersonal touch. They assumed it would all be theirs, neatly divided, a comfortable addition to their already ill-gotten gains. They assumed I had forgiven, forgotten, or simply hadn't known the truth about Clara and Evelyn. They assumed I was just a sweet old woman, too frail, too senile to understand the complex machinations of their greed, too gentle to ever rock the boat. Oh, how utterly, tragically wrong they were. The patience of an old woman is often underestimated, but it is a formidable weapon, honed by years of quiet observation and a deep-seated desire for righteousness. I remember my last truly coherent conversation with Lily. It was a crisp autumn afternoon, just a few weeks before my passing. The air smelled of wood smoke and damp earth, a scent that always brought comfort, a stark contrast to the churning unease in my soul. She was sitting by my bedside, holding my hand, her thumb tracing the familiar, worn lines on my wrinkled palm. The heirloom quilt was draped over the foot of the bed, a silent, knowing sentinel, its hidden secret pulsating softly, waiting for its moment. "Grandma," she whispered, her voice soft, barely disturbing the quiet of the room, "you always told me every stitch tells a story. What's the story of this quilt? The big one, the old one, the one you always seem to be looking at." I smiled, my voice a mere breath, a rustle of dry leaves, but filled with a purpose she couldn't yet fully grasp. "Some stories, my dear," I began, my eyes, clouded with age and a lifetime of memories, meeting hers with a clarity that surprised even me, "are not told aloud. They are discovered, they wait. And the most important ones, they are found when they are needed most. When the time is right, you will know. You will see." Her brow furrowed slightly, a thoughtful crease appearing between her gentle eyes, but she nodded, sensing the unusual weight, the unspoken significance of my words. She didn't press, didn't ask more, just held my hand a little tighter, her touch a silent promise. She always knew when to listen, when to simply be, when to trust. That was her greatest strength and my greatest hope. That was my last true comfort, my final profound peace. Knowing she would listen, truly listen, to the message I had left for her. Knowing she would search, she would find, she would see the truth. Knowing that the years of quiet fury I had harbored would finally find their voice through her. Part 5. The final stitch, the truth unveiled and the new beginning. And then I was gone. My body grew still, my breath ceased, and I slipped away into the quiet. The immediate grief came, of course. The raw, immediate pain of a loved one's passing. The hushed tones, the solemn faces, the endless stream of polite condolences. The funeral, a blur of black suits and whispered prayers, a hollow performance of sorrow for some. And then, the silence that followed, thick with unspoken truths and concealed anxieties, a heavy quiet that masked the churning undercurrents of expectation, of greed waiting to claim its prize. I lay in my rest, but my purpose, my last mission, was just beginning. I knew Lily would find it. I trusted her implicitly, utterly. I knew the moment would come when her sharp eyes and keen mind would gently undo those hidden stitches, and the truth, meticulously preserved for decades, would finally see the light of day. The reading of the will. That was my final stage, my meticulously prepared platform for justice. My grand, quiet reveal, orchestrated from beyond the grave. I knew they would all be there. My son Thomas, perhaps still battling the faint echoes of his conscience, but ultimately blinded by his wife's ambition and his own desire for an easy life. Beatrice, radiating a smug confidence, practically preening, ready to claim her final spoils, utterly unaware of the trap I had laid, the carefully wound spring waiting to release. And Lily, my brave, quiet Lily, who would hold the key to everything, the unwitting yet utterly perfect harbinger of the truth. I imagined the scene with crystalline clarity, a vision that brought a quiet peace to my final days, a satisfaction that hummed in my very bones. The lawyer, Mr. Davies, a new, younger man, would clear his throat, adjust his spectacles. "We are here today," he would begin, his voice formal, "to read the last will and testament of Rose Eleanor Adams." Thomas would shift, a nervous cough. Beatrice would preen, a subtle, triumphant smirk playing on her lips. They would expect their share, their large, well deserved share. And then the first hook. To my beloved granddaughter, Lily Mister. Davies would read, "I leave my home on Sycamore Lane, its contents, and the entirety of my personal estate, with one specific, unshakable instruction. The family quilt, the large heirloom quilt always draped in my living room, must remain with her, undisturbed as her personal inheritance." A collective gasp. Beatrice's face, I could see it, draining of all color. Thomas, his jaw slack, their expectations shattered with a single sentence. Lily, my sweet Lily, would be startled, perhaps confused, but the entire estate. Thomas would stammer, his voice a bewildered whisper. Mother always said she intended to divide things equally. What about us? Beatrice would lean in, hiss whispering, "What is this, Thomas? A joke?" And then Lily, guided by instinct, by my final, subtle training, would rise. She would walk to the quilt, the old, familiar quilt, and her fingers, guided by some deep intuition, or perhaps just a memory of my words, would find that unassuming calico patch. Her brow would furrow. She would feel the unnatural stiffness, the subtle lump within. The whispers would grow louder. "Lily, dear, what are you doing?" Beatrice would demand, her voice suddenly shrill, a thin edge of panic cutting through the pretense of grief. "That old rag, it's nothing, don't damage it." But Lily, my sharp, determined Lily, would ignore her. She would gently, carefully begin to pick at the almost invisible stitches. The quiet scratching sound, amplified in the tense silence, would fill the room. And then the revealing. The small, waterproof packet pulled from its decades-long hiding place. A hush, absolute and complete, would fall. Lily, her hand trembling slightly, would unfold the aged papers. She would read the first line of my letter, her voice clear, gaining strength with every word. "My dearest Lily," she would begin, "if you are reading this, I am no longer with you. But the truth, my darling, must never die with silence." Then she would pull out Clara's true will, the one Mr. Finch had so easily dismissed. And then the journal entries, Clara's own words, penned in her unmistakable hand. "My sweet Evelyn," she would read from Clara's journal, "my heart aches to leave you. This land, these small savings, they are yours, my love, for your garden, for your dreams. My sister Rose and you are my legacy." The truth, delivered with the dignified silence of paper and facts, not shouts and accusations. A truth so powerful it needed no theatrics, no histrionics. It would simply be. And it would shatter their carefully constructed peace, leaving them exposed and reeling. "This is a forgery, Beatrice." Lily would declare, her voice now ringing with Evelyn's own fierce sense of justice, holding up my letter and Clara's true, will side by side with the fraudulent one Mr. Finch had presented. This codicil was a lie. Aunt Clara explicitly stated her wishes for Evelyn and Grandma. "You falsified this. You stole from Aunt Clara, you stole from Evelyn." Beatrice, I could see her, her face turning crimson, then white. Her eyes would dart around the room, desperate, trapped. "This is outrageous. Slander." Rose, she was a frail old woman, she was confused. "Lily, you're mistaken." But Thomas, my son, would stand frozen, the weight of his mother's final testament, the undeniable proof, crushing him. He would see his own complicity, his weakness. His silence would be his judgment. My only revenge, if you can even call it that, was not born of malice or hatred, not from a desire to see them suffer for suffering's sake. It was not about tearing them down just for the sake of it, no. It was born of an aching, profound love. A love for my sister, Evelyn, whose life had been unjustly diminished, whose spirit had been so cruelly broken, her very existence erased by their greed. A love for the integrity of our family, sullied by greed and deceit, a legacy stained and twisted. It was to make sure that Evelyn's name, her legacy, her rightful place in our family was finally cleared, finally honored, finally given the recognition she deserved. It was to ensure that justice, though delayed for decades, through years of silence and quiet pain, was not ultimately denied. It was to ensure that the pain of betrayal, though deep and scarring, would finally be acknowledged, forcing the harsh sunlight into the darkest corners, cleansing the very air we breathed, allowing for a genuine, even if painful, healing. The truth, like a cleansing fire, would burn away the lies. So, dear listener, if you ever come across an old quilt, whether it's tucked away in an attic trunk, carefully folded in a linen chest, or draped over a loved one's favorite chair, don't just see the fabric and the patterns. Look closer. Feel the texture of the old cloth beneath your fingertips. Run your fingers along the seams, seek out the hidden stitches. Because sometimes the most profound truths, the most enduring acts of love and justice, are not shouted from the rooftops, are not broadcast for the world to see. They are sewn, stitch by painstaking stitch, into the very fabric of our lives, waiting patiently for the right hands to find them, and the perfect, resonant moment for their story to finally unfold. And in our family's story, the quilt's last stitch was not an ending. It was, I truly believe, a new beginning. A beginning of healing, of truth, of a quiet dignity finally reclaimed. My Lily, my strong, wise Lily, would make sure of that. And in that knowledge, in that ultimate trust, I found my deepest, most enduring peace. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it finds a place in your heart, too. Perhaps it will even stir a quiet resolve within you, should you ever find yourself facing a similar, hidden injustice. Remember, a quiet heart often holds the sharpest needles, and the most enduring thread of all is truth.